Interdisciplinary Study of Anti-Semitism, and today it's a great honor for us to have Minister Yuli-Yoel Edelstein. They'll be speaking on, the title of the talk today is entitled Demonization and Delegitimization of Israel, a Form of Contemporary Antisemitism. And this is an issue which I think prompted YIISA to actually start to deal with the contemporary forms of anti-Semitism, and many scholars and public figures are actually arguing in our discipline that the new form of anti-Semitism is really the new contemporary, if you will, Jew is the state of Israel, and Israel is becoming the target for all sorts of demonization and delegitimization from radical Islam on the one hand, which we spoke about this afternoon with Michael Walzer, to also the acquiescence of the left from a human rights progressive agenda in which citizenship and equality is guaranteed under laws. Somehow, some on the left, particularly in Western Europe, seem to be, in my opinion, anyways, in the opinions of many scholars, forgetting the basis of this discourse. So, Minister Edelstein is currently the Minister of Public Affairs, and also, importantly in this context, for Diaspora, and he's held this position since March of 2009. He's been a member of the Knesset since 1996, and was one of the founding members of Israel Ba'aliyah, which was started in 1996, and he served on many committees in the party. He served, for example, on the Committee on the Status of Women, the Committee for Immigration and Absorption and Diaspora Affairs, Education and Culture, International Affairs and Environmental Committee, Constitutional Law and Justice Committee, and the State Control Committee. From 1996 to 99, he served as the Minister of Immigration Absorption. From 93 to 94, he was the advisor then to the opposition leader, Benjamin Netanyahu. From 1990 to 93, he was the department head for the Mellet Center for Zionist Education. And from 1988, soon after he arrived in Israel, to 1996, he served as the vice president of the Zionist Forum of Israel. From 1984 to 1987, Mr. Edelstein was accused of fabricated charges by the former Soviet Union, the state of the former Soviet Union, and he served 3.5 years in a labor camp as a prisoner of Zion, or as a refusnik. He was a Hebrew teacher in Moscow, which in those days was difficult and a serious act of maintaining identity and allegiance to the Jewish people of the state of Israel. And he was an Aliyah activist. And I was saying actually in Jerusalem, in December of 1994, I was actually with a friend from Montreal, Stephen Singerman. We went to Moscow and then Leningrad to meet with leaders of the refusnik movement. And we both remember, we spoke today, remembered your case. So it's really not only a privilege and an honor to have you here as a minister of the Israeli government, but also given the history to have you here at this conference as well. So welcome.
Thank you. Quite an experience to hear all your biography unfolding backwards, from now back. Anyway, good evening. Thank you for coming. I'll try to be as brief as possible in terms of lecturing, so that we'll have more time for questions and remarks. I guess this is the best way to really explore issues that are of real interest to people who are present. Well, I will start with saying that in 1918, a book was published in the then Russia, a book by Professor Solomon Lurie. It was called Antisemitism in the Ancient World. I remember reading that book, what used to be called Samizdat, the type-printed books that were not officially allowed, about 30 years ago. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that the most interesting thing about that book is the foreword. In his foreword, Professor Lurie writes that he actually started working on that book, Antisemitism in the Ancient World, in, I think, 1914 or 1915. And then when what is known as the Great October Revolution occurred in 1917, he stopped working on the book. Because, writes Professor Lourier, he thought that every historic research should be somehow relevant. And thus, there will be no more anti-Semitism after the Great October Revolution, because the reasons for the anti-Semitism, the regime, the Tsarist regime, disappeared. There was no use to continue the research. Mind you, the book was published in 1918, meaning max a year later. It took him just a couple of months, I guess, to realize that anti-Semitism was still a relevant issue and to resume working on that book. Starting with this sad sentence to, sad example rather, to kind of stress that unfortunately, I guess we can talk about different forms of anti-Semitism, different ways of anti-Semitism to act, but it's very difficult to be so optimistic as to say that after this or that social change, world change, even global change of the kind we witnessed just 20-something years ago, anti-Semitism basically disappears. On the contrary, in the report that we prepared, and you kindly mentioned that it's part of my ministerial responsibilities, among other things. In the report that we prepared just 2 weeks ago, it unfortunately seems that 2009 was the worst year in the last 20 years in terms of the anti-Semitic acts, attacks, you name it, all over the world. I'm saying all over the world in order to stress that it's not just, this kind of a statistics game that we all know that, say for that matter in Canada the situation was terrible, the numbers went up and it kind of changed the whole statistical picture. That was not the case. All over the world there was, unfortunately, according to the data we have, the worst situation since 1990. And I mentioned 1990 because this is considered the year when a kind of, I don't want to say scientific, but at least serious follow-up started on anti-Semitic events in different countries. I think that to really pass through this report, we have to say that there are two main types, with all the problematic definition of it, two main types of anti-Semitic events we are witnessing. We are going to deal today with what is called the new anti-Semitism, and I'll explain in a second why I have a problem with this term. But we should never forget that still, if we look at the report, in many places, definitely we have some kind of geographic division here. In many places, there are good old acts of anti-Semitism having nothing to do with Hezbollah or Hamas or Operation Cast Fleet. Oh, well, the examples we all know. We can give the recent example, for example, of what happened just a month ago in a country called Moldova, in Kishinev, where a group of churchgoers led by a priest went to some menorah standing there, Chanukiah standing there in the street, uprooted it, even had some ceremony, with the main line being that the Jewish symbols shouldn't be so close to the church. The government apologized, the church leaders apologized, but the fact is, I promise you, that it had nothing to do with the IDF activities anywhere in the world. But at the same time, we definitely, if we're talking especially about 2009, we can't avoid the influence of the Middle East situation, what is happening in the state of Israel, with this ongoing, unfortunately, conflict, and its influence on acts of anti-Semitism. In some cases, like in a clear cut, I mean, when we are looking at a kind of caricature in a paper, and there is a, I don't know, the good old, once away, the good old description or picture of a Jew with a big nose and sticky fingers, either counting money or drinking blood, even if it says on this wonderful personality Israeli, or even if this fellow is wearing something that looks very much like IDF uniform, it's absolutely obvious that we are talking about, once again, something that for years, unfortunately for generations, used to symbolize the classic antisemitism. At the same time, the reason I mentioned that it's kind of, I have a personal problem, it's not something that I'm pretending to write a thesis on, but I have a personal problem when we call it new anti-Semitism. It's not new. Because once again, going back to my personal history, I have to testify that in the 60s and the 70s, it was strictly forbidden to be an anti-Semite in the former Soviet Union. It was allowed, though, to attack Israel, Zionism, and so on and so forth. So the very caricatures, the very descriptions, the very stories about Israeli soldiers, I don't know, drinking blood or raping women or harvesting organs, were part of the official Soviet publications, never mentioning the Jews, the Israelis, the Zionists, the occupants, and so on and so forth. So we can't really factually say that this is new. But definitely, I do have to say first person singular. For me, it always associated with the terrible regime. I never could imagine that in Le Monde, or Figaro, or Guardian, for that matter, I would find the same descriptions 20, 30 years later. At the same time, and there is always this legitimate question, isn't it like a little bit simplifying? We can easily get to the situation when someone who criticizes Israel on anything and says, Mr. Edelstein, I don't like your policy, or I don't like your politics, I would immediately say, you're an anti-Semite. You don't have the right to talk to me like that. Definitely, we don't want to be in that place. So I think that we have to start looking for a definition. There's criticism of certain policies, certain governments, certain countries. What's different about this attitude of attitude towards Israel? I think that one of the definitions that many of my colleagues and myself have been using is the so-called 3D definition, with the 3 Ds standing for demonization, delegitimization, and double standard. And if we apply to certain things happening, acts, pictures, books, articles, the 3 Ds, we can try at least to define whether we are talking about someone who is legitimately not agreeing with something the state of Israel or the government of Israel or the people of Israel are doing, or we are talking about something that looks to me always in my head as, you know, this picture of a stream of water, that if you block it with stones, the water still tries to find the bypasses and the ways out. So now in this post-Holocaust world, whether a respected journalist, professor, political leader, elected official can't write in a paper or can't write in a book anything about dirty Jews sucking blood of children. This stream of water somehow finds its way out in these new forms of hatred towards Israel, towards Zionists, and you basically just by using different terms give way to the same emotions. You know, the examples of that are definitely like the latest examples if we think about them, and they are probably connected to what we were just marking yesterday, the International Holocaust Victims Memorial Day, an official UN date. You know, the most terrible example, I had an opportunity to speak to the Secretary General of the UN the day before yesterday about it, is what happened with Haiti. The Israeli, as we all know, IDF medical, and not only medical, but rescue group was one of the first on the scenes. It was, according to all the sources, including what the UN said to me, it was very efficient. And at the same time, the internet was full of stories about Israelis going to Haiti in the first place to harvest organs. That was the reason that our delegation went there. Our group, our rescue team, went there. So not official, not a single international body signed a thing like that. Not a single respected publication published anything like that. The Internet is full. And no one is even trying to, you know what, to, in the very simple technique, to hide the sources. It's very easy to trace who started it, where it went from. No one is scared. And 2 days ago in the UN, during a press conference, was one of the deputy secretaries there about the situation, the humanitarian situation in Haiti. A Lebanese journalist asked the guy from the UN about the comments on the rumors or on the publications that the Israelis are harvesting olives in Haiti. So what I'm trying to say that I guess this, as I've said, you know, this stream of water that is trying to find its way out finds its way out sometimes in such terrible forms that on one hand you say a normal person can't even think about things like that. But it turns out there are many persons who are, at least look quite normal, and are spreading these things around. And next to it, once again, you know, there are some cases that are not clear-cut cases. 3 days ago, on the eve of the Holocaust Memorial Day, a bishop in Poland says, with the logics of the book of Exodus we are reading these days in the synagogues, was more or less the same strange logic. He says, A, there was no Holocaust. Rich Jews invented it. B, what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians is Holocaust. So, I mean, here it's, you know, you can find, when I say there's no clear cut, you can find kind of both definitions. On one hand, the good classical approach. On the other hand, the modernization of anti-Semitism in its new form. Now, as I promised not to deliver a long speech, and I'm already doing something very contrary to what I promised, I would sum up with saying the situation is, as I've said, very, very bothering and troubling. At the same time, to be a little bit optimistic, I think that things could be done to address the situation. They could be done on a very practical level, and we are trying to do that, like, for example, legislation in different countries. I think that what happened in the last 15 years has been great progress in many countries around Europe, and even some countries outside Europe in terms of proper forms of legislation. In some cases, it's against xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, hatred, and so on, racial hatred, and so on. In some cases, it's specifically targeting anti-Semitism. But I think that there has been progress. There have been cases of persecution according to this legislation. So I think that there is some improvement in terms of that. And by the way, I'm very careful when I talk about the latest report. I'm very careful not to single out specific countries because the data is still coming in. So I don't want to say something and then in 2 weeks from now apologize and say, well, that's not exactly what I knew then. But I can say for a fact that in certain countries the situation is better than the others, not because the population is different, because the governments are taking an acting stand, they're fighting anti-Semitism, they're using the legislation, so you can see that in certain countries the situation is better. By the way, Germany is a good example. If I may give a positive example, and I hope I won't regret it after I get all the statistics. But except for legislation, we have an ongoing body, and I'm sure that people who are interested in it, are researching the field, know about it. There's the Global Forum on Combating Antisemitism that just met in December in Jerusalem last time. But it's a kind of an ongoing forum of prominent leaders, academics, elected officials, human rights organizations, and so on and so forth. And I think that there is influence of that forum felt in different countries, especially to take into consideration the fact that we have inside it the group of members of parliament, international parliamentarian combat anti-Semitism force, by the way, Jews and non-Jews from different parliaments, and the immediate result, for example, of this group is that at least in 3 countries as of now, England, Italy, and Canada, there is a special official, there's a whole procedure, the official parliamentary committee on the investigation of anti-Semitism, investigation of anti-Semitism in those countries. The reports are being submitted, so there are immediate practical results. So to sum it up, as I've said, the situation is really worrying. At the same time, I think that we can get our act straight on it. There is no question, for me at least, we can question everything here, but there is no question about the connection between the things happening in our area and the immediate interpretation into hatred, acts of hatred towards Jews and Jewish communities around the world. But with the proper presentation of the problem, I think that we could try to change this terrible tendency of the rising anti-Semitic attacks. Stop right here.
Thank you very much. So we'll open it up for questions, and I'll take the prerogative of asking the first question, if I may. So, from my perspective, the rise of anti-Semitism is also, I think, to a large extent coming out of the Middle East, Iran, radical Islam, and perhaps the acquiescence of the human rights community in the West to really tackle this. And I would even argue, from my perspective as a scholar, that anti-Semitism and the demonization of Israel is becoming a national security issue for Israel. And I would even argue that the use of the protocols of the Elders of Zion from Iran and from Hamas and Hezbollah
And Egypt.
And Jordan and other places, and Turkey, and we spent a long time just discussing this. But it may be even more of a threat to Israel than the nuclear weapons program of Iran. But this is really beginning to have traction in many parts of the world. So my question is, what is the Israeli government really going to do? This is a national security issue. I think it's wonderful to see the Netanyahu government seems to be speaking, I think, louder than previous governments to this issue, to the rise of anti-Semitism in the global context. What is the government going to do politically, but also perhaps in setting up programs within Israel to reach out to the world to help fight this?
Okay. Well, first, thanks for the compliments about the government position, because I do think that there is a certain change, and I will say something very sensitive. I mentioned that yesterday, the International Holocaust Memorial Day, there is always, for me at least, I have to say first person singular, as a second generation Holocaust survivors, there's always this lack of desire to put anything even close to Holocaust. They don't want to connect it to anything. We have to talk about Holocaust per se. But at the same time, I think that what happened this year, the President, the Prime Minister, myself, with all the modesty, we were all in different places. The President was in Berlin, the Prime Minister was in Auschwitz, I was in the United Nations, and we all tried to explain, without, God forbid, comparing or diminishing or anything of the kind, tried to explain that it's not enough just to say, oh, how terrible that we all, the whole world, allowed those things to happen. And then the next day, go into, in my case, into General Assembly of the UN and listen to another clown talking about the destruction of the State of Israel and say, oh, he's just a clown, don't take it too seriously, don't be hysterical. So we are somehow in Israel, I guess not only in Israel, as a people, I guess we are a little bit hysterical. I do have this strange tendency after the Holocaust to believe people who are saying loud and clear that they want to kill me. We are talking loud. It's not enough just to talk. We had, as it happens every year, on the week of the International Holocaust Memorial Day, there is a special cabinet meeting, and the government decision says that the government should have a cabinet meeting on the issue of the Holocaust Memorial and on the situation of combating anti-Semitism. So this year, when I brought the topic to the cabinet, I submitted also a resolution, a government decision, as we call it in the Israeli procedure, that a special committee should be created to coordinate the issue of combating anti-Semitism around the world, because we view it as a strategic threat. I wouldn't give it a comparisons, whether it's more dangerous or less dangerous than any other danger, but it is a threat. and the decision that was taken basically says that the Director General, which is like the top executive official in the Israeli system of my ministry and of the Foreign Ministry, will submit in 120 days a report to the government, not a report, but a kind of a proposal to the government how we should unite in our effort on combating anti-Semitism and what we could and should do about it. And this is except for the ongoing activities. We have a special forum headed by myself and the chairman of the Jewish Agency, Mr. Sharansky, to follow the situation in different communities regarding anti-Semitism. And I think that in terms of practical steps, there could and should be a coordinated effort. A, because we are talking about a strategic threat. B, because I do want to say that I like it or not, but we are all talking about this direct connection between what is happening in Israel, in the Middle East, and the situation with the Jewish communities, which, at least as far as I'm concerned, gives me also some kind of responsibility over the things that are happening. And we are trying at least to follow up.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
What has been the evidence in the non-Arabic population in France for anti-Semitism? I know it's widely reported in the Jewish press here, but I haven't observed it. I'm not aware of it in France. So can you say a word about that?
Yeah. First of all, you're right, if I understand you correctly, in assuming that in many countries in Europe and France, I would say first and foremost because England is close to it, but the radical Muslim groups are leading the wave of anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism, hence, in many cases, anti-Semitism. But what we do notice, and we can see it even in, I think, in some pictures that I have here from the report, but we do notice that in a very strange manner, the ultra-religious, radical Islamic activists are in many cases joined by ultra-secular left-wing communist-type groups from the local community, and they hand in hand, according to that old joke, you know, what is the brotherhood of the peoples, you know, that when they all take each other's hand and go to pogrom Jews. So this is more or less, you know, the attitude that you see in many of these violent demonstrations or whatever the case might be. So definitely no one's taking demographic statistics. We can't approach a rally like that and try to find out whether it's like 70% radical Muslims and 30% ultra-left-wing French radicals. But the combination is there, including in France, including in England, including in Scandinavian countries. The combination is there.
Yeah, speaking to that, do you think that Israel, are you optimistic or pessimistic that Israel can do a better job of addressing the leftist group? And by showcasing its diversity, the fact that Israel, of all the countries in the Middle East, objectively, and for all its problems and all the mistakes it might have made, the various governments, objectively, is the country that meets closest the vision of the left in terms of gender equality, in terms of tolerance of homosexuality, in terms of the fact that it's the most diverse racially and religious, ethnically in the Middle East. Can Israel do a better job of showcasing that?
First of all, yes. We could do a better job, and that's part of the things that myself and my colleagues are trying to do right now. I'm not sure we're so perfect in what we're doing. But on a more specific note, I would say that most of the people we are talking about right now, hence that kind of a division I was trying to draw between legitimate criticism or disagreement with Israeli policy, or even with like the Israeli side of the conflict, and as opposed to 3Ds, I think this is my problem with just saying, yes, we could influence, in this case, as you said, the left-wing radical groups by trying to explain to them that, say, in Tel Aviv there is gay parade, and in the Palestinian Authority, I don't even want to mention in front of this audience because of the graphic descriptions what exactly they do to homosexuals. Doesn't take us anywhere because people, if my assumption is right, and people who are at these rallies are there not because they really don't know the truth about Israel, but because this is this semi-animal, attitude of anti-Semitism, the very fact that I can provide the facts and figures and the explanations doesn't really help. But having said all that, which brings me back to the beginning of my answer to your question, we could and should do a better job because somewhere out there, there are millions and millions and millions of people who are badly informed, disinformed, don't know the truth, hence have all kinds of wrong perception and wrong understanding of things going on, and they are the audience that we could target with facts, with figures, with showing Israel on a broader scale.
It's a very difficult problem because you have a very intelligent president of the United States who lauds all the countries who are helping Haiti, and he doesn't have enough people to tell him to mention Israel. He just leaves it out. How do you change that attitude? I mean, he has the facts. He has Israelis working for him, and I mean, everybody knows Israelis were there first with the most, and he just shuts up. He doesn't talk about it.
No comment.
Yeah, this might be a little controversial, but given you're here, I was hoping I can ask. Given that Israel is trying to stop the propagation of anti-Semitism, how is it that this alliance of having ideological settlers or Zionists, for instance, in Hebron and these settlements in that occupied territories, that inadvertently does propagate and create anti-Semitism? So what do you see about that? What do you think? How can that be approached in two ways to perhaps further the peace process and also to help stop anti-Semitism?
Well, I personally, I do have to say that I'm not sure that the type of anti-Semites we are talking about fall into this category of people who have this division of liberal Tel Aviv, Bohemian Israeli society and the settlers in Hebron, some of whom are my friends and some of whom are people that I don't want to exactly identify with or whatever. We are talking about a situation in which when we are talking about anti-Semitic drawings, caricatures, and papers, they are not targeting Hebron settlers. They target Ehud Barak, who is, for those who don't know, a leader of the left-wing Labor Israeli Party. The arrest warrant is against Tzipi Livni, the leader of the Israeli opposition, who is the opposition from the left to the present Israeli government. So it's not about someone who doesn't behave towards the Palestinians, hence there's a wave of anti-Semitism. About the promotion of the peace process, I think that the only proof we have about the connection between the peace process and evacuation of settlers or evacuation of settlements is what happened after the disengagement from the Gaza Strip, where all the settlements were evacuated, and Israel removed its forces back to what is known as the Green Line, and the only response was a violent response of about 10,000 Qassam rockets coming out of there. So I think that it would be very difficult for me to try to build a theory that if we would evacuate settlers and settlements, then there will be less anti-Semitism. In the meanwhile, what we have is the only, as I've said, the only example or the only proof is proving the exact opposite.
You mentioned Germany as a good example. I'm from Germany, and
I didn't know that when I said that. So.
I think on the one, we have two problems there. On the one hand, you have very high numbers when it comes to polls covering anti-Semitism. For example, we have a high number of Germans who compare Israel to the Nazi state. It's a very high number. And you have, and with other questions, you have high numbers as well. But we also have another problem. That is that Germany is the biggest trading partner of Iran. And we have Chancellor Merkel, who always stressed that Germany should stand by Israel when it comes to Iran. And she made a very good speech when she came to Israel in the Knesset, but she did not stop this business with Iran and this German support for Iran. So Germany has, I think, 2/3 of Iranian companies use German machines. And it's really very, very important what Germany does there. German companies deliver high technology and so on. And now she said, we are doing much and we will have more sanctions, but at the same time she said we have to do that in with the Security Council. What do you think about this? How is this received? What do you think about it in Israel? That there's a kind of there's a gap between words and deeds.
Okay. When I was referring to specifically combating anti-Semitism on a practical level inside the country, I think that what you mentioned about still, unfortunately, many Germans comparing Israel to the Nazi state and whatever, I think it can only be a proof for what I was saying. It's not that the conditions are perfect and there is not a single German who is attacking Israel and they all are dealing just with soul searching because of what happened. But the very fact that government does take an active stand results in the fact that there are problems, there are skinheads, there are neo-Nazis, there are all kinds of things happening, but the statistics are not as terrible as they could be if it were not for the active stand. Now, Iran is a big problem because here we come to a dilemma. I'm talking right now not about anti-Semitism, not about Jewish or domestic affairs. We are talking about a well-known problem on the geopolitical level. Germany is shaping its foreign policy the way that Israel is considered an ally, and I don't have doubts about it. It's not just for the sake of saying something very politically correct. And at the same time, the situation is that when someone asks the prime minister why there is such a big our prime minister, why there is such a big fuss, and we all have to go to Germany with like half the cabinet to have meetings with the German government, part of the answer is exactly the issue that you're raising, that unfortunately we still have to push and press and ask and explain. But when I called it the dilemma always is the huge economic cooperation here. It's our problem vis-a-vis Germany in a different form. It's our problem vis-a-vis Russia and Iran in a different form. But definitely Israel is not offering the kind of economic cooperation and the kind of markets for any country the way Iran unfortunately is offering. So it's a process. But of late, if I remember correctly, they were like in the last after a big scandal that lasted, by the way, for those who don't, it was not very widely publicized, but it went on for at least, I know about it for at least 3 months, this whole Siemens story. So,
but then the question, how many subsidiaries are they going to create in Iran to continue the trade?
Unfortunately.
Any other questions?
I was reading about Israel purchasing 3 submarines from Germany. Is the Israeli government doing anything, taking any steps to prevent accidental war?
Accidental war?
Yeah, I don't want to say accidental nuclear war, but accidental war. This is perhaps a question you can't answer, and perhaps it's a little bit off topic, but
yeah, I mean, I just don't want to start some like very general answer. Yeah, we are doing what we can in terms of preventing things, and as you know, there were situations when we did feel, I'm referring to the very early 90s, in an immediate and serious danger vis-a-vis Iraq, and still the then, for example, defense minister was even criticized in Israel for such a, hold your horse's position. But I guess there were good reasons, because everyone in Israel was considering the subject that you're raising, and the easiness to strike a match and then to deal with all the consequences.
We talk about the new left and the left in Israel. And in the forefront of those two lefts are Jewish people. What is your explanation, and how could Israel minimize
it? Well, as far as today I had a very interesting conversation with a group of students in one of the universities in New York, and I think that first of all we'll look at some criticism coming towards Israel and what Israel is doing from certain radical left circles, including, as you said, led by people who are Jewish. I think, what I said to those students was that I guess in some very twisted way, but it's also part of the Jewish identity. It's like, it's not just, that you are so liberal that you care about the whole world and everything that is happening, but in this specific case, you still feel Jewish, and you want to prove that, that you are fighting the ultimate evil because of this twist in your identity, and it hurts you so much that Israel is doing something that to you looks wrong. In Israel, once again, we were just talking about it. It's a democracy. I just hope that we don't get ourselves into the situation that we will be so open that the brains fall out. But we are very open, and I'm not sure that I want it any other way with my personal experience. So I'm prepared to deal with the consequences, and it's very difficult because I basically, if I'm involved in a kind of a ping pong with an audience about things that we are doing or not doing in the Middle East, I can easily find all the right answers before there is some person who says, yes, minister, you may be right, but the retired general of IDF wrote 3 days ago in the Israeli paper this and this and this and this, and how come that he totally disagrees with what you say? You can't say that he's anti-Israel, you can't say that he doesn't know. It's difficult. But at the same time, so what can I do? I don't understand it. I think that I know what is happening. I think that Israel is not that terrible. I think that Israel is even to a very big extent one of the best democracies that I know, with all the problems. Definitely I'm making this comparison without saying as a democracy involved in a war conflict. I'm just saying a democracy, period. But there are people who think differently. People probably that think that the standard should be very high. As long as it's not double standard, the way I mentioned it, as long as they are not allowing others, and this is my problem with some radical left organizations. It's perfectly okay for them to see how Sesame Street in the Gaza Strip is teaching 5-year-old children that the best way to live is to kill an Israeli. But at the same time, the sensitivity the other way around is that in a certain place, in a certain school, a teacher said that Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel and forever will stay the capital of the state of Israel. Then there is an attack. How come the teacher is talking politics? So if this is the kind of a double standard, I don't like it. If it's just expressing the radical opinions, no. As we say in Hebrew, shivu samlai.
On a totally unrelated matter, that there was a Jewish judge standing at the same podium 24 hours ago from South Africa who works for the United Nations. But
No.
Is there any evidence for opposition to anti-Semitism in the Arab and Muslim worlds?
Very little. Unfortunately, very little, and it's really troublesome. Because I didn't touch on this subject, but what I mentioned right now about Sesame Street is This, at least, you could attribute to, the war situation. They don't find the proper limits and the proper borders, and they are like teaching the future generation, which is very sad for us in terms of the solutions for the conflict and politically. But as the professor was saying, we can find dozens of witnesses evidences how on state TV in Arab countries you get different versions of modern protocols of the Elders of Zion, and I for one, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know of many examples of someone local getting up and saying, guys, you're playing with fire. It starts with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews. Let's not play with this. Unfortunately, that's not the situation, and the power of these things in many cases is really disgusting, and you sometimes just wonder how these things travel. You kind of associate many of these things with Eastern Europe of 150 years ago, 120 years ago, and they are part of the reality in modern Arab or Islamic world. And I, for one, don't know of much opposition.
Yeah, it's a little bit different, I think, in Iran. I know that in Germany there are a lot of Iranian groups, opposition groups, who are really looking on what's happening in Israel, and they are longing for support. I know that, and they are looking very closely on how Israel reacts to the opposition and to what's going on the streets. And when at the New Year the Israeli president addressed the Iranian people, I know that it was very important for the Iranians. And so I know from my friends I'm working with in Germany, my Iranian friends, many of them like to go to Israel and look at how it's like and talk to the people, and they are unhappy that they are not invited. And I know from the other side that it might be a little bit, not so easy to do that. What do you think about?
Well, first of all, it might be different in Iran. I would still, as you can imagine, as I guess every normal person was watching those pictures coming on Twitter or Facebook or wherever out of Iran, and was shocked because, A, because of what was happening, B, because most of the world was standing idly by and watching, but at the same time, I wouldn't exaggerate. I don't think that if I was my, say, kippah skull cap would appear in front of those opposition demonstrators, I would win the popularity contest. I'm not sure that they are such a pro-Zionist and pro-Jewish crowd. They have their internal disagreements, but there are still many of them are radical Islamists, and many of them, unfortunately, for years have been swallowing this whole wave of and look, let's face it, it's for us, it's easy to talk about it, we know the facts. When someone doesn't, and from the age of 0 is getting on the TV those stories about Jews killing Muslims, raping Muslims, destroying homes, all of these things, it influences. We can't deny that. But on a more positive note, Iranian society is to some extent different because it used to be a modern society till a certain period of time. And for example, one fact that I can mention is that there is a website of Yad Vashem, of the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. They have about 10,000 visitors from Iran, not using the language, not visitors from Los Angeles, but from Iran. So there is sign.
And also Kol Israel, the Voice of Israel, the radio station in Farsi.
That's me. I'm the minister in charge. Yes, we are broadcasting. Yeah.
And it's one of the most popular shows in Iran.
In Iran, we're not doing enough in terms of that, but you're right.
One question. The Goldstone report, is it anti-Semitic, misinformed, or are there parts of it that are legitimate criticism?
Good. I don't think it's anti-Semitic. I think it's biased. By its very mandate. And, you know, I just, the previous meeting, I quoted something that I just recalled. Many, many years ago, when I was a student, I was reading a book by a famous linguist in the beginning, wrote this book in the beginning of the century. And he, in his book, just to prove a point, said that it's impossible to compare between a carrot and a phonema. And when Goldstone, in terms of his mandate, his committee, is trying to prove that even both sides were wrong, Hamas was wrong and Israelis were wrong, or both sides were in something right and in something wrong, for me it's an impossible comparison. It's just there's no basis for comparison. So from the very beginning, I think that inevitably the report was biased. I was, by the way, part of the ministerial committee, 5 ministers that decided not to cooperate with the Goldstone committee, and as far as I'm concerned, if I would have been asked to vote against today, I would vote the same. Because there were good Israelis who, not representing the state of Israel, went to Goldstone and submitted information and papers and their evidences and opinions and whatever, and nothing of this appears or was taken into consideration by the report. That's why I'm saying that there was no real attempt to find the truth and the facts. I can give even sadder examples about certain points of the report where for example, it turns out that he didn't even bother to read the Palestinian press. Okay, we Israelis, we are all propaganda. But in the Palestinian press, there were things that contradicted totally what Goldstone was saying about certain things. For example, in the Palestinian press, there was an evidence of a 14-year-old boy in an official Palestinian paper saying that, sorry, I don't have the exact quote, but the boy was saying in an interview that they didn't want Hamas activists in their house, but the Hamas terrorists came and were in their house, and as the boy says, and if you would try to escape, or if you would try to tell them not to go in, they would shoot you in your legs. So it's in a Palestinian paper. It's not Israeli IDF propaganda machine. So, and all those things were not taken into consideration by Goldstone report. Now, something that is more relevant to the conversation about anti-Semitism, I did take the liberty, for example, to say to Secretary General of the United Nations the day before yesterday that I am worried about the implications or the influence of the Goldstone report on this wave of new anti-Semitism. Even if that was not the initial intention, neither of the UN nor of Goldstone himself, the very fact that this kind of atmosphere is created and there's this kind of legitimacy given to all kinds of organ harvesting stories, and this is very close. He didn't write anything like that. But if, like, there is step 1, it's very close to step 2, and then there's the step 3, and so we are doing all those terrible things. So someone who is publicizing papers of this kind, and someone who is on the campaign to promote this report till this day, I think should take into consideration that not every person who is getting hold of this information of this report is professor of international law who is analyzing. There are other people who say, that's exactly what I thought about those Israelis and those Jews.
We have time for one more question, the young man.
Sure. I think there are legitimate reasons to question the authenticity or the process of the Goldstone report. But I do think it's important for any society that is democratic to have a mechanism for self-criticism.
Absolutely.
So you described a number of real shortcomings from that report. Could you maybe share with us some ideas of what might be a more legitimate or more appropriate mechanism of self-criticism?
By the way, there's thank you for the question, because there was even like some kind of misunderstanding here in this country and even in the Israeli press. It appeared 3 or 4 days ago that Israel is preparing a response to the Goldstone report that will be submitted to the United Nations. This is just incorrect. And You asked a very good question, and I think that Israel is a kind of a front runner, even some say that even it runs too fast in terms of checking itself after every military operation. In some cases, when there was reason for that, there were even special committees headed by Supreme Court judges, and we all know first Lebanese war and some other cases. In this case, there was no necessity to create a committee like that, but there were a number of investigations, mostly taken by the IDF. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have a paper in front of my eyes right now, but I think 136 reports were investigated by the IDF. Reports of misconduct, abuse, looting, all kinds of things. Some of them happened. Yes, there was an Israeli soldier who went, I'm ashamed of it, who went into a Palestinian house where the family obviously had to run away or whatever, and he took a credit card from there and some money that he found and some other valuable objects that he could find. Terrible. Really terrible. And there were several cases of that kind. But none of the investigations showed definitely any deliberate assault of civilians or any of the cases close to the Goldstone report. So what actually is being done right now is that the IDF is collecting all this information of many of the investigations. Some of them happened before any Israeli ever heard the name Goldstone, and some of them happened parallelly to Goldstone Committee, and some have been finished not long time ago, and most of the results are being submitted according to the request of the Secretary General of the United Nations, are being submitted. The request, the exact request was for Israel to provide all the information coming out of the investigations and checkups of the Operation Kasli. That's exactly what we are doing. And you're absolutely right. It's very important for any country to follow up on the things it's doing. It's the first and basic sign of any democracy.
Okay, so on that note, I'd like to thank you for coming. Thank you for the police presence here, help. And thank you very much. It was an honor to host you. And on behalf of YIISA, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.